Hi, I'm Jason Emmerich, and I'm your host again for another edition of Caribbean Law TV. Joining us, as always, is Professor David Rowe, University of Miami School of Law. And our guest today is Christine Tudor, a second-year law student at the University of Miami School of Law in Professor David Rowe's Caribbean Law class. Today, our discussion is going to be about capital punishment. Christine is taking the view against capital punishment, while Professor Rowe is going to advocate for it. I'm not sure how we drew it first, but who is going to go first in today's edition?
I think I'm posing it, so I'll go first.
Fantastic. Well, Professor Rowe, thank you as always for joining us, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Jason. We have a major crisis in Jamaica currently. That crisis relates to a crime wave of very serious proportion. Unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, there have been media reports of the rape of an 8-year-old child, the rape of 5 women in one family group, and there are continued reports concerning arbitrary shootings and stabbings, killing of individuals for what appears to be criminal purposes. A significant police official who was retired was recently killed, and a police officer who was going home peacefully was shot near his home and killed. Gang violence has been a problem in Jamaica for the last 20 years. It has become more serious as the years have gone by. What needs to be done from a legislative standpoint to address this, what shall we call it, this very significant crime wave? There have been more than 1,000 murders in Jamaica this year. This is a very traumatic experience because Jamaica has as its major source of revenue tourism. I believe that in order to address this crisis crime wave, Jamaica should consider the adoption of the death penalty. The death penalty is already on Jamaica's books, but is not being implemented by the government. And I propose that there should be capital punishment for premeditated murder and for rape of brutal rapes, particularly rapes of young children. The justification for this is that in those societies where the death penalty is serious and carried out quickly, it is a deterrent to unnecessary violence and to wanton murder. Additionally, Jamaica, from an economic standpoint, is in a situation where sooner or later the murder rate, which has affected us so severely, will destroy our tourist trade and put us in even more serious circumstances. The time for the death penalty applied justifiably in accordance with the rule of law and appropriately is now. Without it, we face the possibility of never being able to address the crime wave which threatens all Jamaica. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rowe. Christine, that is a pretty serious argument by Professor Rowe, and I know you have a daunting task to defend it, but you also bring up some good points we talked earlier. So please introduce the people watching us on their TVs what your thoughts are and why you don't think the death penalty is right for Jamaica.
Yes, I'd first like to thank you, Jason, and thank you, Professor Rowe. Yes, just like Jason outlined, I'm opposing the death penalty. Professor Rowe raised some really great points, and as he mentioned, the crime rate in Jamaica is out of control, specifically brutal crimes such as rape, as you mentioned, and murder, of course. My concerns are, does the death penalty actually deter crime, and also the possible moral implications of implementing capital punishment in Jamaica. He believes that capital punishment will deter crime, and that's what the majority of Jamaicans do in fact believe, but this isn't necessarily true. Numerous studies have shown, especially in the states, that U.S. states that implement capital punishment sometimes have even higher murder rates than in states that don't have capital punishment. Their rates sometimes are comparable, but never ever lower. When Jamaica considers whether they should begin implementing capital punishment, they should be not just implementing it because of popular opinion, but really look at all the facts and see if it would actually achieve the results they're seeking. A lot of commentators, such as Professor Rowe, they believe that it's a deterrent because if people believe that they could face severe punishment for their crimes, they won't commit them. But oftentimes the crimes, especially in a hostile environment, as some of the areas in Jamaica are, they're crimes of passion, they're crimes relating to drug use. Criminals, especially hardened criminals, are not going to be rational thinkers who consider the implications of their actions. So a death sentence for them wouldn't necessarily deter them. And going into my second point about the moral implications, does the state have the right to even decide that they could take a life, even if they come to the conclusion that someone has taken another person's life? The UN, for instance, has pointed out that they're increasingly stating that they feel that capital punishment is some sort of a human rights violation. That, we really have to question whether in civilized, progressive societies, whether that's even moral or plausible. Because a lot of myself, I would argue, and others who share my opinion, implementing capital punishment oftentimes perpetuates the culture of violence, which is trying to hinder. In states, for instance, in the U.S. that see such high crime rates, even though they have high capital punishment, oftentimes the problem relates back to a culture of violence that the death penalty doesn't address. And I would propose that rather than looking just at capital punishment, whether that would work in Jamaica, we should look at solutions that actually attack the source of the problem. That means reaching kids before they become criminals, reaching out to schools, because that's really the underlying problem. There's a culture of crime and violence that is growing, and that's where we're seeing the high crime rates. And if you put a damper on that, rather than, prevention is always better than cure, rather than saying, well, we're going to punish criminals this severely, let's go to the source and see if we can stop people from becoming criminals, or help people to take a step back from that lifestyle. So I would propose a solution as improving law enforcement. My family is Jamaican. I've visited Jamaica numerous times, and one thing that is very apparent is that there's a very disorganized system of law enforcement on the island. You don't get the sense that police officers have much control or power to control crime in the areas where they are, and that's a major problem. Criminals are emboldened by the fact that they know that they won't be held accountable because they won't even be caught. They don't feel like they'll be caught, and they oftentimes aren't caught. And a lot of times, even with these high murder rates, they never know who even commits these murders. People go missing on the island, and they have no clue who even is responsible. So my proposition for solutions is to, number one, improve law enforcement, and number two, to really work on changing the culture of violence down there, reaching out to kids in schools and just helping the society to take control of itself, and for young people even coming up to realize that their actions will have effect on the society, the economy, and taking responsibility in that sense, rather than taking it's instinctive to want to have people pay for their actions, but like I said earlier, that's not the role of the state. So rather than having people, passionately say, well, an eye for an eye, if you kill someone, you're going to pay for it, and this is going to deter crime. Take a step back, take the rational approach, and really see what else can be done rather than implementing capital punishment. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Those are some great points. I don't think any of us up here will disagree with the solutions. Prevention is always better than the cure. But Professor Rowe, what about right now? What about the effects of crime and the brutality in the crimes. How do we combat that to end that now? And then work on what Ms. Tudor is saying, the prevention, so we don't have to have this cure that must be or should be talked about with the capital punishment issue.
Well, you know, they say the wishes were horses, beggars would ride. The problem is that we have a very serious, current, immediate problem in Jamaica. Solutions which have worked in the United States will not work in Jamaica because of the difference in society. Who will protect the rights of the victims? Those who have died and those who are going to die this year at the hands of flagrant, unnecessary violence. These criminals, in many respects, have been recently referred to by a well-known police officer, Bigger Ford, as dog-hearted, and that's quite true. They don't have any humanity in them. It is time for us to implement the rule of law in Jamaica, to enforce the rule of law in Jamaica, and to stop murder now. It is time to bring the murdering and the murderers to a halt. Who is going to pay to preserve the life of murderers and keep them paid and exercised at the state's expense forever? The only cultural violence is the violence that being wreaked on the Jamaican society by this dog-hearted minority of criminals. They must be brought to book. The biggest problem in Jamaica is that sometimes the criminals are in league with people in the higher areas of society, and the corruption in Jamaica protects both the criminals and the high members of the society. This has to stop. Professor Dice's concept of the rule of law needs to be implemented in Jamaica. The death penalty will do a great deal to stop the wanton violence which obtains in Jamaica now.
Well, Christine, what are you going to say to stopping the violence right now? Is capital punishment even a viable option for you to help deter it now? Your solutions are valid. You bring up great points. But what do you think about the violence now, and how do we stop it, and how does Jamaica go forward from here?
Great question. Professor Rowe mentioned that, and you outlined as well, that it is definitely a serious and very current problem. But if you want to talk short-term results, implementing the death penalty is the wrong way to go. I mean, in order to ensure due process, the process that would even take for someone to be, face judgment for their actions would be very long-term. The immediate solution, as I mentioned before, would be really, really strengthening law enforcement, protecting communities through law enforcement. And like I said, the system is completely in shambles, it's unorganized, and no one's really mentioning that enough, and instead death penalty is at the forefront, but that is definitely not going to be a short-term solution or a long-term solution. And once it's implemented, it would be very hard to turn back the clock. If, for instance, it's implemented and results aren't seen, the process again to change it back would not even necessarily work. So it's definitely a very, very serious, issue that's at the table, and it takes a lot of thought and consideration before it's rushed into. And yes, the crime rates are extreme, but the death penalty is an extreme notion, so it shouldn't be rushed in. And if you want short-term, immediate solutions to the problems, the most clear and honestly obvious choice would be to really strengthen law enforcement, have them crack down, have them trained better organized, and in areas where they need to be. That would be my response. Thank you.
That's a great response. I think excellent points were made all around. Thank you, Professor Rowe. Thank you, Christine. And thank you, most importantly, for joining us for another edition of Caribbean Law TV. I hope to see you again soon. Good night.